Hello, and welcome to Designing Storytelling, part of the 2022 Animation is Film Festival. My name is Allegra Frank. I am an editor at the Daily Beast. I cover movies and music and TV and, most importantly, video games, which is why I'm here today talking to four talented, lovely designers who specialize in very cool parts of game design, an important part of game design, characters, among many other things. So I want to go around and introduce everybody, and then we're going to talk about how character design and design in general plays into games and storytelling in games, which is another pretty important part of games. Some games don't really have a story, but you know what? That doesn't make Tetris any worse than any other game.
I love that.
But I love Tetris. I love the story of Tetris. All right, to my left here, I have Justin. Justin is currently, he has freelanced for companies like Way Forward. Most recently, he has worked on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Shredder's Revenge. He's also worked on games like Adventure Time, and he's worked with Yacht Club on Shovel Knight. He's also worked on some other fan favorites like the Scott Pilgrim vs. the World game back in 2010, as well as some earlier mobile games back in the day in 2002 at Gameloft. So Justin, you have really been all over the place in the industry.
Yep.
You've had a storied career.
Yep, bit of an old guy at this point. Yeah, that's all correct. With Tribute Games, as I have been on and off for the last couple of years, Shredder's Revenge was our latest release, and fans seem to dig it, so happy to be here.
Yeah, congrats. That was earlier this year, so busy year. We also have Alexis Dean Jones to my right. Alexis is an animator, character designer, and storyboarder from Australia who is based now in Canada, and most recently she's worked on the game Chicory, A Colorful Tale, which is a very, very cute game that she did character designs and animation for. And she's also working on a secret new game, which I don't know if you can spill that secret for us tonight, Alexis, but
probably not right just yet.
Well, that is fair. But thank you for joining us. Yeah, Chicory is a great game that just came out last year, so I'm sure you're still riding that high of a wonderful game release.
Still working on it a little bit.
Yeah. That's how games work these days. They never stop being made. And beneath me, I have Joe Gauthier. Is that how you pronounce it, Joe?
It's Gauthier, but it doesn't really matter.
A 2D artist from Montreal who has worked at studios such as Thunder Lotus Games, where she has done art direction for Jotun, Sundered, and most recently Spiritfarer, a very, very cool sort of cozy game, as they call them these days. Another recent big hit. So thank you for joining us, Joe, a fellow Canadian.
Thank you for having me.
Canadian resident. Really international group. And then last but not least, we have Jesse Jacoby, who is a painter based in Detroit. And he most recently, after doing work in other fields like music and film and art, he worked on the game Norco, working on the pixel art for the interior and exterior scenes, characters, and animation. So Jesse has an interesting, varied background that brought him to games, which I'm excited to hear more about. Thanks for joining us, Jesse.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Now that we did that whole thing, we're going to actually get to chat. Introductions are always the least fun part. Now we get to do the fun part of talking. So what brings all of you guys here is that you have worked on designing parts of games that make up so much of the game, but maybe are the smaller sort of elements that people they often take for granted, I think, especially in these smaller indie games that are so intricately designed, but oftentimes if they're pixelated, there's pixel art, or because it's not very high quality, expensive graphics, I think people can often, downplay the beauty and artistry that goes into the creation of those designs. Also, I'm so sorry, there's a siren. I live in New York City, so there's always a siren. But I want to know from each of you guys, so what sort of informs your design process? Just if we can go around, I'll throw to Justin first. Maybe tell me a little bit about what specifically you work on as a designer on games like Shredder's Revenge, and what do you pull from when you're creating your designs? What inspires you? What comes first?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It's a pretty complicated answer. For us, we're pretty old school. Gameplay comes first. So animation and designing characters, it's a very iterative process. We want to try and get the feel right, and that you have to work very closely with game designers, and you get a loop of feedback. Once the game feels right, then you can kind of build off that foundation. So for us, it's really about how the game plays first, and then once you have those pieces, you can kind of build off of it. Again, once gameplay is set, then you can kind of add flourishes and other parts to it that kind of enhance the experience. But if the gameplay isn't solid and it doesn't feel right, then you're working from a shaky foundation, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's so core, being that these are video games, but I think that's what's so interesting too, is the character design is such an integral part of the gameplay as well. It's not just characters acting as static pieces of art. It's actually how they fit into and interact with the game design. Is that sort of how you've experienced it?
That's exactly right. And it's such a weird, it's kind of hard to explain, like, how does a game feel right? I guess it's all about the intent. We predominantly do action-based games, so a lot of the story gets told through the actual game. You want the players to sort of act it out themselves. And again, it just has to feel right. Yeah, I can't say really much more about it than that. If people can elaborate or feel differently about it, but for us, it's always gameplay first.
Yeah, Joe, I think working at Jotun, the games you've worked on, Spiritfarer, Sundered, Jotun, they all have, working at Thunder Lotus. I said Joe and I thought Jotun immediately. But I think that's another studio where those games have very specific kinds of gameplay, and each one is also very different. So how do you approach designing art and characters for those games, considering the gameplay, but also wanting to have this sort of consistent Thunder Lotus brand style when a game like Spiritfarer and Jotun are so different gameplay-wise?
Mm-hmm. I think we're kind of lucky in the sense that because I've been art director in all three, we kind of have the same base, as in, like, I can't just become someone else, so my style is always going to kind of be transparent and show throughout all of our games. But in terms of specifically design for me, the first step is always to ask questions, like especially if someone from the narrative team comes to me and is like, oh, I have this idea for this character. Well, I can't just take like a very basic description and run with it. I usually, like, for me, my favorite approach is always close to kind of problem solving. It's always, like, for me, fun to chat with my coworkers who are in charge of, designing the move sets or like the actual background of each character, to know really like what these characters are living through, what they should be acting like. For me, kind of the questions that I ask, if I'm asking the right questions, I think that's usually what is what transpires at the end of the journey when the game releases and the player gets to play, because they get to kind of experience that that whole, I don't know how to say it, but like just that entire thing, that whole that works together because the right questions were asked at the right time and they were answered properly. So for me, it's like a good foundation. I ask the right questions and then I go from there, and then we build off of each other. Like I'll be inspired by the narrative team, and then the narrative team will like see what we're doing in the art department. They'd be like, oh my God, I have ideas, and build off of that. And then like the design team is like, oh my God, this, like we could really use like this kind of moveset, and then it just keeps going. It's a Mobius strip of like inspiration.
That's really cool. I mean, yeah, I think both to what you were saying and also Justin, it is all very integrated, every aspect of the creation, which is what is so interesting to me about a game like Chicory, Alexis, where creating is basically what the game is. It's about an artist making art. So there is sort of that meta aspect. Obviously, this artist is not a human. It's a very cute little dog. So it's not exactly one-to-one. But how did your design process inform that game, considering that the game is about the design process in a way?
Yeah. Yeah. I think whoop.
We're good. My lamp fell.
Oh no. I don't know if that was a lamp or a bird or
New York baby.
It could be anything.
And everything's falling. We're good.
I live in an alleyway, so apologies in advance if you get some truck noise. But yeah, a big part of Chicory was that you are playing as an artist, but you're not playing as like a professional artist. You're playing as someone who was just like kind of hurled into the job of art, and like definitely isn't coming at it from like a place of like professionalism or like knowing what they're doing in any way. And so that definitely informed a lot of the like design of the game. Like we wanted it to feel like kind of loose and playful and like non-threatening in that kind of way. So, like even if you're not like an artist coming in to play it, like you'll have a good time and like be able to feel like you can like make a mess and like make marks on it without like and like feel like you're making something of your own. Chicory's the first game that I've worked on, more or less, coming from like doing animation and like all sorts of stuff in the past. So like I definitely had a lot to learn about like everything that I was doing on the game. And we also had like a very, 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 very small team. So yeah, there was definitely a ton of like back and forth. Like I work next to Greg, the director of the game, and the writer, and I was talking to like Em, the sound designer, and Lana, the musician, and Madeline, the background artist, like every day. Right. So there was like tons of back and forth, and we definitely all sort of shaped all the different bits of the game in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I assume that's another big part for indie gaming. It is generally small or very, very small teams. So, of course, you're able to have more of those dialogues than perhaps larger animation character design departments might have. But even still, it does sound like it is true that they're just so interconnected regardless, but you benefit from being that close to every single person who's in charge of every single aspect of the game.
Yeah, I definitely felt like we benefited a lot from being able to talk that much and that, have a lot of back and forth.
Yeah. So you mentioning that you came from not exactly game development makes me think of Jesse reading about your background and how diffuse, I mean, not exactly diffuse, you've been in the arts, but all kinds of arts. And then coming to Norco, which also, unlike the rest of these games, is very much of a sort of classic point and click style. So I'm curious, one, how your process worked with the gameplay style being sort of more restricted in its way, being a point and click. So you do have some more, static environments and backgrounds that you're working with, as well as being someone who is coming at this from, a visual arts background to, 2D painting and film and everything else you've done before games.
Sure, yeah. I was kind of chuckling in my head when I heard Alexis talking about the player character in Chicory, which I have not played, but I am aware of and am meaning to, especially after hearing you talk about it, because you mentioned that, the player character is someone who's sort of thrust into a situation that maybe they don't feel that they're equipped for artistically, and that is, for me, very relatable to my experience with Norco. And Allegra, what you were saying just a moment ago about, the nature of the game being somewhere between a classic point and click and maybe a visual novel, was good for me in the background that I come from as sort of a traditional painter. I've largely always focused on environments, weird landscapes and stuff, with maybe a character or two in there. I've done a little bit of character design in my paintings, but I never really considered myself a character artist ever. And the path to Norco was interesting because long story short, the director of the game, Yutz, asked me to do the key art painting for them. So I completed that, and it went well, and through that process I sort of got to know them, and we just all hit it off together and became friends. And a couple months went by, the scope of the project was growing, and still we had a super small team. But somewhere around, like last summer, they were sort of thinking like, this is, we need some help. And one of them sort of half jokingly suggested that I learn how to do pixel art and like just help them make game art for the actual game. So I said, what the hell, this is a super cool opportunity. I believed really strongly in the vision of the director. So I learned how to do pixel art really fast, and luckily it turned out well. So yeah, I had sort of a crash course in translating my painting practice into pixeling, which, you have fundamentals of scene composition, light and color, the basics and so on. So there was some crossover from painting to pixeling, but on the other hand, it was completely alien to me. I felt, like I was in way over my head. But luckily the director, he had a really strong vision all planned out and everything. So that was helpful when we got to character design and animation, which I did end up doing a lot of for Norco. So it was sort of just a crazy, super fast, super busy learning process. But I'm proud of how it turned out, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a beautiful game, so I'm excited that you got to work on it and it turned out so well, especially being a total newcomer. I think that's very inspiring to hear. So in the interest of talking about storytelling and how all of what you guys do informs that aspect, I wanted to ask actually Justin first, because I think a lot of the games that you've worked on compared to the rest of the group perhaps may seem more story light. A game like Shredder's Revenge, not to say it is absent of a story. The Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles have a rich canon, I would say. But it's more about the gameplay, as you said, that comes first. The character interactions, the systems at work. So what about the work that you do helps to create what there is of the story, whether it's through even just character animations, like how certain villains look or act? How does your work sort of help create that aspect of the game, insofar as there is some story?
Yeah. And that's all very correct sort of assumptions. Our games, although they're not story light, there's probably a lot less words, although, again, not devoid of it completely. But I think it's really like the old expression, actions speak louder than words. If it's something that, you can visually see instead of having to sit and through dialogue, I think that's always a preferred way of getting a story across. So for us, again, once you have the fundamentals, I'm sorry if I'm sounding like a broken record, but, we're very workmanlike in our approach. We make sure that everything, all the right pieces are in play. And then once we've gone through a very sort of iterative process and everything feels right, then you can work in comfort with all these extra flourishes and stuff. Sometimes it's just animations happening in the background. I think we were praised quite highly for it. And I'd also be remiss to say, if we didn't have a small army of freelancers working for us, and how that much that aspect of working on games is important. Had some solid art direction with Adam Marin, our art director, and my fellow animator in-house, Mathieu Godet. We shared responsibilities in that respect. So communicating that to your freelance workers, and really they knocked it out of the park. We like to try and do a lot of the stuff in-house that's very core to the gameplay, and then once that's sort of taken care of, it's kind of like go nuts, like have as much animation in the background or in secondary characters or in little cutscenes that happen in between the gameplay. But it's fine because that the main core stuff is taken care of, and then people can kind of have fun because it's not so impactful to the gameplay. So yeah, a bit of a process, but we figured it out. And I'd say, again, team effort. Thanks again to all the people that worked on it.
Absolutely a team effort. I mean, I think there are certainly many games out there that are just 1 or 3 people, but when we think of indie games in particular, but it is absolutely a team. So we love a shout out. And yes, I think thinking of other games on your list of credits, like Scott Pilgrim, which is a fave of mine, thinking about it in that way of like, there is story there, but it is so much more than that also does cohere to help create the story. Like that's a game very much about people's fighting styles and how that relates to their actual characters. So I think that does come very through games like Scott Pilgrim and Shredder's Revenge and Shovel Knight, those sorts of games where it is more about the characters individually, I guess, as opposed to the overarching story.
Exactly. And who's to say, maybe someday we'll have a very story-rich game, but animations will still be a part of it. So, I think, animation is always a very important part of that. So,
totally. Joe, so obviously Spiritfarer has this very large audience that kind of loves coming to it in the same way that people do with a game like Animal Crossing. As I said before, it is considered a cozy game. So there is this comforting element to it. And I am curious how your work on the game, intentionally or not, led to that sort of feeling, as well as how the story and your work on the game also creates that feeling. Because I think that game in particular is so interesting in that it is defined by its sort of vibe as much as what it actually is. So how is your work on what it actually is contributing to that vibe and the story as well?
Yeah, Spiritfarer is a special case in comparison to like Standard and Jotun that we did before, because with Standard and Jotun, it was very much the style is meant to fit the tone of the game and just meant to, you know, be on equal, like say the same thing. Both of them just go into harmony, whereas Spiritfarer was purposefully kind of different. Is like the game, yes, is cozy, but it's also like a very dark game, and it's meant to make you feel things that are usually very uncomfortable. So the style that I came up with for that was in response to that. It was a way to alleviate the weight of the topic. It was a way for people for me to make people feel more comforted, because it's such a welcoming world. It's warm, it's bright. It's not just gray, it's not sad, it's not destroyed, like completely destroyed. So every time you have like a very sad beat of the story, every time you feel like you've cried, you've lost someone because you had to let someone in the game who is a friend go and pass away, you are left with like time, like, you know, you take the time that you need to grieve and move on, and then when you load back to the next scene, when you come back to the gameplay, you're welcomed by the same colors that you knew. You're welcomed by this like gentle, just a gentle blanket of like, well, life keeps going and it's gonna be okay. And that's why, like, for me, the stuff for Spiritfarer was very important in that it was not dark, it was not sad, it was not like depressive. It was very much on purpose, like purposefully made to be warm and welcoming and cozy because of the nature of the tone of the story itself.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. That's really interesting, I think, and also powerful of your work, you doing your work, being so cognizant of the story and the emotions that are going into it and what you expect players to get out of it and how the design accommodates them as they experience this story.
Yeah, I think we had that pretty early on, that realization that it was going to be a heavy game, because a lot of the stories were gathered on a voluntary basis from like people on the team. So a lot of them are based on real people who passed away, so they're linked to very real emotions. So very early on, it was on the table that like, okay, we have to be careful and we have to make sure that people feel respected, that people feel that they're given that room to exist and to feel their emotions. And that comes through colors, palette, composition, like the environment that you're in. If you're like in a little room, it's very claustrophobic, it's not nice. So the expense of the sea and the gentle waves crashing against the boat, and like everything comes to calm you down, basically.
Yeah, that, I think I've played games that I think do that very well as Spiritfarer does. Games that especially deal with death in such a personal way. It affects you differently, but still just as clearly, depending on how it's packaged. And yeah. I think that's a great example of, you don't want it to just all be tiny rooms and boxes. You want it to feel open.
But sometimes like you can do that on purpose. A lot of games we really like hammer that home and like really play on that feeling of being stuck somewhere. I think that's also like a very valid way to go about experiencing like that kind of grief emotion. I think it's just not the way that we wanted, because we knew it was going to be very sensitive.
Yeah, totally. So tonally, I think a game like Chicory is quite, well, I don't want to say it's totally opposite, but it is a more colorful, light-hearted game, story-wise. But also, as we said before, Alexis, in terms of it being a game by designers about design, I do wonder, you having a very intimate knowledge of the practice of art, how did that work with or against the creation of a story? Again, it is not like a documentary of a game. It's not about the granularities, but were you able to help create and redefine the story through your animation work and character design?
Yeah, there was like, kind of like I was saying before, like I think pretty much everybody on the team had like things to add to the story, and like Greg was kind of discussing it with us a lot as we went, as he was like writing certain bits, and we'd have like a lot of conversations about it, about the building of the story. Yeah, it does get into pretty kind of nitty gritty emotional parts of being a person who creates things, and like the kinds of expectations that other people have for what you're creating. And like the person that you're playing in the game is a person who their job is to like make the world beautiful, basically. And it's a job that's been around for a long time in this universe, and there's a lot of baggage associated with it. And the protagonist, Pizza, doesn't really know that when they like take up the brush, the mantle at the beginning of the game, and it kind of, they're figuring out as the player is figuring it out, that there's a lot more, a lot to unpack. Right. in that kind of a job, and they have to kind of figure out like whether that's something that they really want, and like what parts of it do they want, and like do they have to take on every single part of it. And the game ends up being a lot about like challenging that and whole the whole ball job, basically. The whole idea that one person should be responsible for that. But yeah, so like my experience like making art and stuff, and Greg's experience making art, and everybody else, we all definitely had a lot of personal feelings to bring to that kind of a story. Yeah, and there was a lot of back and forth, and even if something was already in the game and somebody played through it and had a feeling of like this feels a little bit off, or like doesn't this is like even to the like nitty grittiest of like like playing through a part and being like, this like one sentence really like hits me strangely to that degree. We would go through and make changes, and yeah, like Greg was like very receptive and flexible about that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think story and writing also is just very important. When we talk about story, it's the totality of the thing, but even right down to a single line, things can change or adapt, both how you approach the game design, but also how you're approaching the writing. Mm-hmm. So Jesse, as we talked about before, the game that you worked on, Norco, is more like you said visual novel yourself, and visual novels are so heavily based on story. So I would say of all the games here, I think Norco perhaps is probably the most text heavy.
It's a reading game for sure.
It is, yes, it's a reading game. So creating characters and backgrounds and illustrating this story, essentially, how in tune were you with the writing and the narrative designers in terms of defining the look and how you were approaching the art of the game?
Good question. For Norco, it's such a hyper-specific game in terms of location and environment. Norco being a real place outside of New Orleans in Louisiana. The director grew up there. Largely, it's a game that came from his experiences living there. And so, in terms of story and how I can serve that through the environments and the characters and the animations, it was and like the others have said here, the back and forth with him was nonstop, like up until the very last minute. Countless iterations, tinkering, straight up deleting things that had been there for months, completely redoing things when we probably shouldn't have because there was barely any time left. All of this, but I always had the director there with his own lived experience to really help guide me, not just with the environments, but specificity, in terms of how characters should look and feel from this place. I would see how they speak in the script, what they want, what are their conflicts and what are their feelings and so on, and how can I translate that into pixels. Was really fun to figure out, but I just thought of this one time he had me working on a secondary. Now, this is like just a total NPC you have maybe a couple interactions with, and the prompt was like, this has to be a punk character. They're hanging out in a bar, and I remember drawing this thing up, and he's like, well, this is good, but let me tinker with this so it looks more like a New Orleans punk. And so it was really helpful to have that, and the story was what drew me to the project as a whole. The story is absolutely the core of the game, and it interested me from the very beginning when I was just making the key art. I remember laying in bed at night, just thinking about this world he had created and how I could help bring that to life. So I felt very invested in the tale that he was trying to tell, and trying to do justice to these characters and make sure that I could try to do my part to help the player really connect with all these weird people that you meet. And I hope we succeeded. I also, one thing too, I wrote this down just a minute ago when Justin was talking about, sort of you get your core in place and then you have some freedom to sort of just go crazy with secondary animations and little things in the background and all of that. And so that was a lot of what I ended up having fun with, is things that maybe weren't directly tied to words that characters are speaking on the screen, but what sort of interesting things can I put in the background? What sort of like long loops of idle animations can I make NPCs do to just really bring the world to life? And it was really eye-opening to me because you don't have that in traditional painting, obviously. So constructing these scenes and making the characters, it's like, yeah, that looks good. But I'd go over it with the director and we talk about what certain characters could be doing, and those little touches so often just totally change how the world feels and really helps pull you into it.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, because I think something that a lot of people remember and pay attention to with games are things like the idle animations.
Right.
There's so many memorable interactions with NPCs, or just putting the controller down and turning and finding that your character has been stretching or
right.
yawning or something this whole time while you were looking away. I think that's a really core part of the experience from the gamers, the players' end. So thinking about it as the artist seems both very fun, but also can really change the experience that you have to the game as you're making it too.
Absolutely, and I think that's unique to games too. Obviously, as an art form, it's an art of immersion, and what are all the little things you can do to make the player feel a part of that world? I think that's kind of what it's all about, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And you actually got into another thing I was wondering about for both you and then Justin in particular, for the actual individual character animation. So thinking about these smaller moments that are happening in the background that you get to toy with. And also, for Justin, creating all of these multiple characters in the case of something like Shredder's Revenge, right? How they do have to have some similarities, but also differences. How long does it take to really nail down, okay, these are the core animations I want this character to have? Do you start with a plan? And I know maybe this is a tough one, but do you start with a plan of like, Donatello will move this way, and then by the end, Donatello moves that way instead? Or the New Orleans punk does this with his hair, but now by the end, he spits out his gum instead. How do you get from that point A to point B? How long does that take?
I mean, I can't really put it to percentages or anything like that, but yeah, when we started, and I can't take the lion's share for any of this, again, team effort, I can't stress that enough given the size and scope of the project, but I think all the turtles shared a same walk cycle just to get the feeling down of like, what's the proper movement speed? And then once that's sort of established, you can work with comfort and going, okay, this feels right. Now we can do an iteration for Mikey's run and for Donatello's run. And so it just happens in steps. Maybe you can break it down to something like a quarter of your time spent. Well, you have to have a first prototype, and your first prototype has one of everything, but very basic. And then once that's all done, you have one boss, one playable character. This is right or this is wrong. Then you can do like many different layers, and sometimes you throw a thing out. I think right up until the last minute, some extra throws were added per character. So like, it's kind of amazing how like a very sort of like big swath of change can happen, and it adds quite a bit. But iterative, it happens in a process. I know I'm a broken record, but you have to make sure everything just feels right, and then you can work in comfort. I mean, when you're animating monkeys at the end, it's because you've probably got most everything else right. So that's comforting in its own way. Yeah, you start by doing the basics, and then you're doing monkeys. That was kind of a nice feeling.
Go ahead.
I can relate a bit to that, just in the general sense of having it be, it's hard to pinpoint how long and how much effort goes into each one of those little things, especially when you're in constant communication with your team. And there were so many times where I felt like I wasn't really just working on one single thing. Yeah, I could go on and on about that, but we got a time constraint here, so.
Yeah. I should just also add, we also had the extra pressure of working for a client. This was not an original creation, so that'll get things moving really fast.
Right.
Nothing like a deadline.
That is true. You're working off of, there's specific examples and requirements that you have to work toward.
Exactly.
Which is interesting thinking about a game like Jotun Joe, where this is a character who does exist ahead of, you guys did not create Jotun as a sort of Norse character, but you got to reinvent him through the game and through your storytelling. So how did that process evolve while creating the character in that world, knowing that there is this impression of this idea, this figure, but you want to make him your own? So how did you as a designer on the art side help to keep the initial inspiration and things we know about this character, but also reinvent them for the game?
Yeah, for Jotun, Jotun, the name Jotun is actually the race of giants in Norse mythology. So all of the bosses that you have in Jotun are Jotun. They have different names. They're based on different runes. They're also based on different elements. The main character is Thora. we completely made her up. That is not a real historical person.
Yes, right. That
yeah, like the goal with Jotun, because as the first game, was to immerse ourselves in Norse mythology. I did a lot of research. I did a lot of following, like I followed like a university course on literally like Norse traditions and just how they lived back then, basically. And like I did a completely unnecessary deep dive on like the textiles that they used. But there was a lot of trying to see what was described more vaguely and what was very precisely described, because as an oral tradition, a lot of things are modified with depending on who's telling the story, who wrote it down. So there was a lot of spaces that we found that we could iterate on, that we could be like, oh, well, this could mean this. And as we see from like this person who told this story, it like they interpreted that way and they passed it on that way. So there was a lot of ways we could reinterpret and like kind of make it our own without making it literally a representation. This is not like a guide to Norse mythology, but a lot of it is, you can find a lot of words, you can find a lot of topics, a lot of places that we referenced, that people, if they just read the words, they'd be like, wait, I think I know this, or I don't know this, I'm just going to Google it, and there will actually like find a lot of information. There's a lot of characters that we reuse, that we mention in the game, and a lot of that was done on purpose, even if it's not completely explained in the game. It's very much environmental storytelling also. Like Justin mentioned in the first question, Jotun very much relied on environmental storytelling to convey a lot of the story. So yeah, that was Jotun was very much an exercise in show, don't tell, with a little bit of voiceover sprinkled in at the end. Just because we could, because Icelandic sounds amazing, so we did it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is very cool, working off of Jotun as this larger, as opposed to it being like we are making a story about Thor or something like that, especially now with the Marvelification of everything. But a character.
Oh, even back then, I remember like right. It's like weighing on us, because we were like, we know Thor is represented this way, but we also know he doesn't look like that at all in any of the description in Norse mythology. What do we do? So we went with the like most accurate as you can get with oral language traditions. And then obviously we took creative liberties, because I don't have like a super realistic style, so obviously it's a little cartoon.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really fun part of working off something that is your inspiration text, and then you are allowed to play completely with it. So Alexis, talking about environmental storytelling, I think Chicory also does a very good job of environmental storytelling, and you coming from a background also outside of games, kind of like Jesse, in animation, I wonder what you were able to bring from your knowledge of animation in other types of art outside of gaming into the environmental storytelling that is so defining and so present in a game like Chicory.
I definitely brought in a lot of ideas that didn't work.
Didn't work.
The animation in particular. There's a lot of game specific things that I needed to learn. Like that if the character is going to do a jump, we can't anticipate that because we just need to get right into that. Yeah, things like that. Yeah, I can't claim credit for the like actual environments themselves. That was Madeline Berger, who's our environment artist. I was pretty much just in charge of all the characters, design and animation. But yeah, I like what Justin and Jesse were talking about a lot before, with background incidental kind of animations. I definitely had a lot of fun doing a lot of things like that, and trying to like just inject like as much personality as I could to like every NPC. They all like there are like every person who's in the game is like an individual person. There's no like repeated character models or anything. It's been a lot of individual animations, a lot of idols. A lot of them, if they have like a lot of dialogue, they'll often have they'll have like different expressions that they change to. But if they don't have different expressions that they change to, then I would like at the very least give them an idol with some kind of an interrupt or like some variation in the loop, even if it was just like they had their regular idol that they were doing, and then every now and then they would like do like an ear flick, or they're all animals in case anyone's watching this doesn't know that, or like the silliest one that I did was probably for a character called Stevia, who their idol is like they've got their hands in their pockets. They're kind of a punk, and they're like doing this sort of cocky lean back and forth. They've got a bunch of stuff in their backpack, and if you see them idle for long enough, they'll like lean back too far, and a pen falls out of their backpack, and they like quickly notice and like whip back and grab it with their arm and stuff back in their bag.
Wow.
And, so I really love putting in stuff like that. But like, I'm pretty sure not everyone is going to notice or see. But I hope that some people do and like get a kick out of it, because like. Yeah, I felt like that was a big part of my job, was just to add as much warmth as I could via the character animations. Pizza, the main character in particular, has like I think Pizza has 63 distinct animations, and 10 of those are just emote poses, and then some of the other ones we also use for emote poses for certain circumstances. And then they've got like 35 different facial expressions, and we would like mix and match those to get the character to act in certain ways, like sometimes during dialogue, sometimes outside of dialogue. So it's a lot of there's definitely a lot of opportunity for like visual storytelling.
So how is that, and this is something I want to ask you specifically because you have a long animation background, but this is coming to games. But for everybody, how is that different from the other kinds of animation you've done? Because as we've talked about, there is something so special about games where we can have these idle animations. Like, I'm not watching a cartoon and staring at it long enough, I'll notice something different happening. I mean, perhaps sometimes, but that, because film has editing and different shots, and that's not how it is meant to work. It doesn't just stay static on one screen, and then something can happen if you leave it long enough. Mm-hmm. So what is something that you wanted to bring from animation from animation outside of games to gaming animation? And what is something from animating within games that you wish you could do in other disciplines?
I'll start with the second part. The second part, like something that like really struck me, like as I was working on the game, was how, like, well, once we got to the point where people were like playtesting, which is pretty early. Once we got to the point when people were playtesting and actually had animations in the game, it struck me how special it was that like everyone is going to have a different experience with it, and it's not like it's not just our point of view. Like an animation is very much like the like directors, storyboarders, animators, layout artists, like very specific like decisions that they've made about like this is exactly what you're looking at on this frame. And with the game, there's going to be like combinations that people come up with that are different from what anybody else is seeing, and like circumstances that come up, and like little things that they figure out that they can do that are like really special and unique to their own to their own playthrough. And that's really fun. That got me like excited to do more games for sure. Yeah. And like bringing things from animation, I guess just like wanting to do way too much animation.
Yeah.
which I think is like fun to do sometimes. And I was able to sneak in some like really extra moments that Greg probably wouldn't have put in if it was entirely up to him.
For sure.
Yeah.
That is really fun. I really need to play more Chicory because those sorts of cute touches are the things I most remember. So I appreciate you sneaking in as many things as you could. So Jesse, so I want to bring this sort of to you, but also broadening it out because you have worked in painting and film and other kinds of visual arts. What is something that you brought from those worlds into working on Norco, and what's something that you learned from working on Norco that you are excited to bring into your painting, gallery art, other arts
Sure.
that you do?
I guess, bringing my practice into Norco, we were so strapped for time that it was, when I was learning pixel art through this whole process. So in a sense, it was all I could do really to try to translate, my work in painting to video game form. And that took a lot of figuring out, but I guess to put it very simply, like thinking of color and light, thinking deeply about it in each environment, and sort of, I sort of just treated everything that I was working on like it was a painting because that's all I knew how to do. And it's maybe a unorthodox approach to pixel art, but we ended up with what we ended up with, and I hope at least it's unique. Now, as far as things that I learned from Norco that I would like to bring back into my own practice, there are all sorts of things that pixeling made me re-examine in my own artistic practice. Fundamentals that I thought I had understood, like color and light, like I mentioned, thought I had a pretty good grip on it. I didn't. And things like perspective, because for what we were trying to do, we had to nail those things to make it feel like a convincing place that you're inhabiting, or else it's just not going to work. We agonized over that stuff. So I learned a lot, and it's been jarring going from pixeling back into painting now, and not in a bad way. But I had basically did stop painting while we were working on the game. So we wrapped in the spring, and I have been getting back into painting, and I've definitely noticed that there are things that I have taken from my experience with Norco, and even in regards to thinking more about characters and subjects that I'm putting into my paintings now, and thinking deeper about light and color. And I feel like I was lucky to receive a great deal of artistic growth from working on the video game, for sure.
Yeah, I think that's the ideal experience as an artist, especially dabbling in a new medium.
It was a dream. Yeah, I couldn't be happier with having done all of it. So.
That's really cool. Joe, I really liked what you were saying about, when you're working on Jotun, taking a class in Norse mythology. But to bring it back to art, is there anything else that really inspired and inspires you in your work outside of games? So do you also go study painting of the era that you're trying to invoke, or are there other animated works or directors that you're really inspired by? What are other artistic influences that you bring into your game design, your character design?
I'm going to give a very boring answer, and it will say everything. But more specifically, for every game, there's usually I usually look for, unless it's very specifically Norse mythology, which is already pre-decided. I have a source and I know where to look. But usually, in terms of style or in terms of like inspiration, I will look for either projects that have already been done, like movies, like anime, anything that is striking visually, that it doesn't have to convey the same message, but has the same mood or the same, like a tone that we want to aim for. Even if it's just like traditional paintings, like I'll go for like Renaissance painting, or like I'll go into like early medieval and be like what does this make me feel? If the answer is exactly what we're trying, like, oh, okay, this is what we're trying to get at, I try to study that thing and take bits and pieces of everything and try to make it a whole. That's what I did for Spirit Fair also, just being like, oh, there's like this great woodblock painting artist that makes a lot of sceneries that are just amazing, and you feel like you're there. You feel the calm, you feel the peace, you feel the wonder that he had when he traveled, Yoshida Hiroshi, and that's the thing that I wanted to take from the experience. It was trying to not copy, because you can never be a copy. All you'll be is a copy of another artist, which is not the goal. It was really to try to emulate like how to convey that feeling, how to make that part of the style. And I do that for every game. I'll try to find like something that is very striking, that conveys the same kind of emotion that we're trying to do, and I'll try to break it down and see what I can take from it. And then obviously my style comes into it, and then we have like the artist on the team and I just brainstorm and just go wild with character design and stuff.
I think everything is a great answer, and I think you elaborate.
It's hard as like visual artists not to just walk around and be like, oh, this is amazing. Oh wow, like I'm inspired, and just everywhere you look there's usually something new you haven't seen. So
yeah, I mean, I think that's true for all artistic disciplines, but especially visual art for sure. And Justin, I'm going to throw it to you for the final question. So as someone who's worked on, we've talked about Shredder's Revenge, but also Scott Pilgrim and also Shovel Knight, games that have a very sort of distinctly cartoony style. I'm curious if there are specific cartoons that inspire you, or something perhaps much more surprising. Maybe cartoons don't inspire you at all, and there's some other art that you draw from.
No, I'm afraid I'll give a very boring answer. It's a lot of cartoons. It's a lot of video games. I actually don't. When I talk to friends, I realize I don't have the same baggage of having watched most movies that a lot of people did. I really just grew up playing a lot of games, and coming up with the company and everything, we wanted to kind of try and foster that, like, pay homage to the things that really influenced us growing up. So, that 8-bit aesthetic and stuff. It's nice to see younger generations now kind of we pass the torch, and they kind of carry it, and they didn't necessarily grow up with that nostalgia. So seeing younger generations do the same kind of things we did without having grown up on it, I think that's probably one of the most rewarding things now. And it kind of becomes this cyclical thing where you feed off them, and then they feed off you, and you can feel like you've kind of done your part in preserving a tradition, I guess. So I'm inspired by the next generation that continue to do great pixel art and cartoony styled things, but I also like that younger generations also kind of grew up with like maybe a PlayStation era or an N64, so you're seeing a lot of like now low poly games come out, and they're kind of cheating it the same way we did, where we didn't make it quite to the specs of an 8-bit machine, but they're cheating it stylistically in a way that it still references those old consoles. So yeah, the younger generations, I think they're really nailing it, and that's what I really draw a lot of inspiration from these days.
Honestly, a perfect way to end. We love looking forward. That is very sweet. That we have hope for the future is what I always like to hear. This was such a great conversation, and thank you all so much. I really enjoyed speaking with you guys. And yeah, again, this is Design is Storytelling for the Animation is Film Festival. And I'm here with Justin, Alexis, Joe, and Jesse. Please go check out their work. I'm sure we will have links for you all to check out. And play their games, keep making games, enjoying art, and thanks for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.